Welcome, everyone. While people are having a chance to come into the room, I'll just make some preliminary comments, which is the first of the thank yous to my wonderful speakers. I'm so glad that you're all here, and we look forward to having an engaging conversation because you all bring with you decades of experience. And I feel that we've done a pretty good job of sending that material out and that it's very accessible on the web. So I'm going to be inviting you to speak from your heart for this moment and for us to work in a number of rounds. The challenge is huge for our session, but the resources that we have to share and the movement building that we can do together is equally awesome. So my name is Grove Harris. I am the Director of Global Advocacy for the Temple of Understanding, and we are hosting this event. It's actually a joint event. It's part of the Temple of Understanding's Eco-Justice series, and it also is a parallel event to the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. And their subject this year is about, indeed, ending poverty for women and communities and building the structures that we need to make that possible. Our title today is Towards Ending Poverty and Building Eco-Justice for Women and Communities. To the people who are here in the room already, I believe that the chat is enabled for you and we welcome your participation. We will be having time for Q&A, and you'd be welcome to introduce yourself in the chat as well, because the connections that happen amongst us all are part of the opportunity, particularly of the attendees for the Commission on the Status of Women. The Temple of Understanding is one of the oldest interfaith organizations with both ECOSOC and Department of Global Communication status at the UN, focusing on eco-justice work and interfaith understanding across multiple sectors: science, policy, activism, youth, women, indigenous voices, towards a sustainable future. And spirit informs our work as we listen to the wisdom of so many religious traditions. We are honored today to have Teresa Audre here, who is an Aboriginal activist and artist, and she has kindly agreed to start our session today with a land offering. Please, Teresa.
Hello, everyone. This is a great honour for Grove and everyone on the panel here. I'll speak in language first. I speak 7 of my Indigenous Australian languages of my bloodlines, mostly all connected with the ocean. Katango Narawan, Puteri, and Duluma Nangamaya. So that means welcome to the ocean. So Katango Narawan means where our mountains meet the ocean on the coastline. And so I'm an ocean-born person, and I connect with my humpback whales. And the ocean is very cleansing, and even the smell of it is what we say, duluma, so magical. So it's a great honour to welcome everyone to this session today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa. Did you want to tell us a little bit about your backdrop?
Yes. I'll move out of the view a little bit. So this painting is about women on country, and it's about women on country, and the big.
You need to speak to the speaker, I'm afraid. To the.
Oh, sorry. So the artwork is the big circles behind me with the women. They are what we call bunangs, and bunang means ceremonial grounds where we pass on all our culture and knowledge on country. And then there's little water holes like in the big circles with the women around doing ceremony. And water is very essential for us, especially as women, when we bring our babies, or what we call borais, home from hospital. They dunk straight into the ocean because it's our salty tears that remind us that we came from the ocean, and that will go back to the ocean one day as our our humpback whales. The footprints is actually the children, where they walk around when we're doing ceremony and stuff to actually learn knowledge from the women. And when the boys are 12 years old, they don't longer stay with us. They do stuff with the men. It's just the girls throughout, that consistent nurturing all the way through. So,
thank you so much. And now for our first speaker, let me introduce Dr. Riane Eisler. She has dedicated decades of her intellectual leadership to laying out the transformation to a partnership model rather than a domination model. Ramifications include a care economy in a more caring society, along with equality between the sexes. GDP measures the wrong things, and there are many better measures to use. And I'd like to just give you the end quote of some of her recent articles to take the burden off of her of what she needs to speak about, give her more room to speak her heart. Domination systems produce high levels of stress and fear, from stressful early family experiences to artificial creation of economic scarcity. Partnership environments enhance the expression of the capacities needed for a more humane and sustainable future. Our human capacities for caring, consciousness, and creativity. Riane, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. And it's wonderful to be with you all. As those of you familiar with my work know, I look at the larger picture. And when you look at the larger picture, when you use what I call a systems approach, you no longer do what we've been all taught to do, which is to marginalize women and children. Now, we've all been taught that. And it isn't just our, quote, education, both formal and informal, but it is actually the social categories. We have been taught, you know, right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern. They all fragment our consciousness, so we cannot connect the dots because these dots leave out or marginalize these huge, huge issues that affect the life and, yes, the death of the majority of humanity. So you heard Grove talk about the domination system and the partnership system. And these are new categories that are beginning to gain currency, even though we are seeing a lot of trends today towards partnership, but they're all disconnected. You know, the environmental movement is here, the women's movement is there, the children's rights movement, which is brand new, you know, is over here, the racial justice movement is over here. These are all trends, actually, to move the paradigm, to move our consciousness from domination to partnership. Now, I want to start with something that may sound strange, but, you know, because we've all been taught that, quote, women's issues are, you know, they just are women's issues. They don't really affect the whole system. Well, actually, what my research and now the research of many others is showing that how the roles and relations between the two basic forms of humanity, and of course, everybody in between, how these are structured is a core family, social, and economic organizing principle. And I'm going to jump to economics. I'm going to make this a bit nonlinear. If you look at our economic system, whether it's capitalist or socialist, you see that it has perpetuated a gendered system of values. For both Marx and for Smith, you know, the fathers of capitalism and socialism, they both challenged a tradition of domination. You know, Smith challenged mercantilism, the control of kings and so-called nobles. Marx then came along and challenged the bourgeoisie, but they both saw, they made this distinction and they perpetuated this distinction between so-called productive work and reproductive work. And for them, the work of caring, which is coded feminine, right, in domination systems, was to be done for free, you know, caring for people starting at birth for free by a woman in a male-controlled household. And so it's not even included in our conventional measures of GDP and GDP. I mean, think about that. So what is economics really about? It's about what we value and what we measure, right? We value what we measure, and we measure what we value. So our job is nothing less than to change the paradigm, to make it an inclusive paradigm that no longer, and this has everything to do, there's nothing in either capitalist or socialist theory about caring for our natural life support systems. It's all of one cloth, isn't it? It's all about dominating or being dominated. And it does not even consider that there is another alternative. And I'm going to close that in the book that I'm best known for, The Chalice and the Blade, which I think you mentioned, it's now in its 57th US printing and 30 foreign editions. I show that European indigenous traditions, and they were very similar to the indigenous traditions that we also know from the Americas that Teresa, I'm sure, is quite familiar with. There were millennia of gender equity and therefore more peaceful and more sustainable systems. We don't want to go back to any good old days, but we want to use that configuration. And how gender is viewed and structured is a major theme of those pushing us back, whether it's the Taliban or fundamentalist Iran, you know, religious Eastern, or whether it's another so-called religious, you know, the rightist fundamentalist alliance in the United States, but whether it's Putin in Russia or Stalin in the former Soviet Union or Hitler in Germany, always one of the key themes is a rigidly punitive, male-dominated, authoritarian family and that kind of state. And there is a link. And I'm going to stop here because I know I've given you a lot to think about, and we'll go on.
Riane, I can't resist asking you to just give us a snippet about an additional book of yours on sacred pleasure.
Oh, that's really one of my favorites, you know.
We've laid out a framework, but I think the sacred pleasure is another key. Could you just say a moment about that?
Well, sure. The subtitle of Sacred Pleasure is Sex, Myth, and the Politics of the Body. You know, we're hearing a lot about trauma today, which is another partnership trend, by the way, just unpacking that, because domination systems are trauma factories starting in families, economics that create artificial scarcities, etc. But in Sacred Pleasure, I look at both sexuality and spirituality and how they're related to everything else. So it's really foreshadows so much of what I've written since, The Real Wealth of Nations, which is about, as you said, Grove, an economics. I mean, it introduces an economics of caring and partnerism. I mean, of course we need free markets, but we don't happen to have a free one. And of course we need enlightened government policies. But what we really need is to go much deeper. And that takes us to what we value, and it takes us to gender and to childhood, and it takes us to our stories and to our language, very fundamental things, which if you take a look, those pushing us back pay a lot of attention to those. And so people who consider themselves progressive don't, and we need both short-term tactics and long-term strategies focusing on these four cornerstones of family and childhood, of gender. I mean, that's where neuroscience shows that we really internalize our values and our worldview, economics, but going beyond both and incorporating the partnership elements of both capitalism and socialism and story and language. So anyway, that's a lot, and it's all foreshadowed really in Sacred Pleasure.
Thank you so much. And it also gives a lovely segue to hearing from Teresa, who I think will share with us more about the importance of story. And I've also asked her to bring in the piece of eco-justice, because without healthy lands, we can't possibly move out of poverty or prosper in the ways that we must. So Teresa, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so with my community, you know, it may look lovely and very flourishing and part of paradise, but underneath the soil is toxic. And what I mean toxic is actually the PFAS that was used by the military, which is only 5 minutes away, HMAS Creswell, Navy base. So in the early 70s or late 60s, they was using the foam, which was PFAS, to put out fires. And because of that, they washed it down into our waterways that we can't drink fresh water in our community still to this day because of that toxic water. And it's in our animals, our native animals, and even so much in the soil, you know, over a generation like us, but our native animals too, our kangaroos and stuff. And with this PFAS, we've had nearly 30 women die from breast cancer. And the youngest was 15 years old. And I've gone through cancer, but not breast cancer. So I had cyst on my pancreas, which I'm now in remission. Thank God for that. But with this PFAS, we're actually, there's different, it was interesting when they set up different military bases in Australia, they were always close to First Nations communities around Australia. And it's the First Nations communities that are suffering from this PFAS that it's poisoning. It's like killing us all slowly, you know, and it's worse up in Williamtown, up north, in Uluru, which you may know as Rock, but the proper name is Uluru. And, so the naval base near there is there's more women that died there. I think it's over 120 women and children, mainly the girls, that have died from breast cancer. And because of the country has been separate, it feels like our country has been separated from us. And because I live on an Aboriginal fishing community, you know, our ocean is our life, our life source. And they're saying we can't eat fish, you know. I only eat seafood, I don't eat meat and stuff. And so when you look at that, it's it's not only taking our cultural ways of knowing and doing on our country that we've been doing for thousands of years, but to actually stop us from eating fish, which is our daily thing, you know, and also our connection with my totems, which we say buri, our humpback whales, and they are our resource. You know, resources in our cultural link with our old fellas from the past to the present and emerging. And so we have to look after them as well, you know, not only us, because it's them, what I said earlier when I did acknowledgement of country, the salt water, the salty tears is our pathway back to the ocean. So we came from our buri and we go back to the ocean. But, you know, the sort of talk in a lot of our communities that are connected with the ocean around Australia is that, well, will we ever get to go to see our afterlife, our old fellas, you know, and because our ocean is so toxic. And only last year in December, there was a humpback whale in our water that was pushing a dead calf around for 2 weeks until our Caring for Country rangers came and took the whale, the baby whale, away from her. And when we actually cut him open, he was full of plastic bags. That poor thing did not have a chance of survival. And we had to go through a ceremony to bury him with my ancestors, because they're all buried in the sand dunes. So they actually face out the ocean, because we have to have a splendid view even after our life on Earth, on Mother Earth. And so when this happens, and climate change of all things, you know, with the PFAS that is, you know, so toxic to our country. But when you look at climate change and our big season that we've had to go through, because our ancestors' skeletal remains and our humpback whales. So on our main beach, just off my community, we have 150 whales that beached themselves, humpbacks, in 1965. I was still in the stars then. But when you look at that and the high seas that are smashing into our sacred sand dunes, we've had to rebury our ancestors to a higher ground. The same with our humpback whales, because there's no difference. They're still our ancestors. So these are the sort of shifting things, not only in my community, but a lot of First Nations communities around Australia, even it's in the desert or along the coastline of the ocean. So it's very concerning for my people. You know, we've never had to do this before, ever, you know, to have ceremony for our ancestors. And they're our resting places, you know, and it's bringing home to my community and a lot of other communities, you know, this thing hasn't happened. Even in my grandmother's time or my mother's time, my parents, but it's happening in my time, and my grandchildren also are seeing it as well, you know, but one thing I must say, that with all these traumatic sort of emotions that are going through because the change of our country and our ocean, it's within us, what we call but, it's our heart, but it's actually telling us to prepare in how we're going to face it in the future, and especially in the present right now. So this is what's made me, I'm the only one in my community that's sort of gone out and sort of protested about the ocean, you know, deep sea mining that affects our native animals, our humpbacks and all sea creatures. It busts their eardrums. So that's why they actually, they commit suicide, you know, they beach themselves, is because when there's sonar from naval bases that they send out, it busts their eardrums and it makes their intestines and all that organs explode from that pressure. So they're absolutely in agony where they have to beach themselves. And this is, it just breaks my heart, you know, and so this is what I do, you know, and who I am today. And I urge you all to look after our oceans in our country, because they're very, very special to each and every individual person on our planet we call Mother Earth. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you so much, Teresa. I think we'll all be able to readily agree that ecology and the economy are totally, particularly at this moment in time, overlapping, and that having a sustainable life, ending poverty, really requires profound attention to both of those pieces. Thank you so much, Teresa. And also thank you for getting up early to join us. Very appreciated.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Next, I'd like to ask Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris. The religiously informed struggle to end poverty is a profound calling for her, and all the more important in our polarized world. She will speak to the work of the Poor People's Campaign, their initiative to bring out low-income people to vote, but mainly she's here as the executive director of the Cairo Center, which for 20 years has been a national leader in fighting the interlocking injustices of systemic poverty, racism, ecological devastation, militarism, and the false moral narrative of Christian nationalism, as well as uniting the poor across all lines of division. Liz, thank you so much for joining us. And your work is broad and deep. I'd welcome you to share what's on your heart and mind with us, joining into this conversation about how to move into an abundant life at all economic levels.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's thanks for the invitation, and it's really an honor to be alongside these beautiful thinkers and leaders and fighters. So yeah, I think what I wanted to kind of bring was, I've been doing very grassroots anti-poverty organizing led by those most impacted for much of my life. I joined the welfare rights movement in this country when I was a teenager. And I was recruited into that by poor women of color who had been long organizing in these kind of yet to be United States, both before and in the wake of things like the welfare reform and other attacks on poor women and kids. And so what I wanted to think a little bit about with folks here is, as we think about kind of building solidarity, as we think about what it looks like to end poverty and to achieve eco-justice today, I think we have both a lot to learn from the kind of plight, the fight, and the insight, as we talk about in our work, of these unsung heroines, including welfare rights moms and other poor women who have been fighting and organizing for a long time, as well as what people are doing, still today. There are some words from Johnny Tillman, who is the first kind of director of the National Welfare Rights Organization back in the 1960s. She wrote in Ms. Magazine in the 1970s, I'm a woman, I'm a Black woman, I'm a poor woman, I'm a fat woman, I'm a middle-aged woman, and I'm on welfare. In this country, if you're any one of those things, you count less as a human being. If you're all of those things, you don't count at all, except as a statistic. Welfare and economic justice is a woman's issue. For a lot of middle-class women in this country, women's liberation is a matter of concern. For women who are poor, it's a matter of survival. And so I wanted us to think a little bit about, struggling every day. Poor women, especially women of color, have to depend on organizing in our communities across these lines of division, coming together, making the connections between the economy and race and gender and ecology is just a matter of survival. And if we look at what's happening in our world today and in the United States today, there's 135 million people who are poor or one emergency away from absolute economic ruin, more than half of them who are women, girls, and femmes. A third of the US electorate are poor and low income people. And yet too few of our politicians are talking about things like poverty and living wages and the child tax credit and healthcare and clean water and air and land, which are really the concerns of the majority of people, especially women, the majority of the time. And so we often, when we're talking about these issues, we hear that ending poverty isn't possible, that somehow demands for ending poverty and eradicating racism and turning the war economy into a peace economy and saving the earth and everything living in and on it are too much, or they're too costly. But, it actually costs the United States $1 trillion a year just because we have so many poor kids. It's actually more costly not to end poverty than to end it. But what we need is the political will. And so, what we're doing at the Cairo Center and in the Poor People's Campaign is, in the words of Dr. King, making those in power say yes when they may be desirous of saying no, right? Building that kind of moral consciousness and political will to have a different way. This is not as good as it gets. We can actually achieve justice. But from the perspective of the work we're doing, it means mobilizing and organizing, registering and educating people for a movement that votes. So right now, again, we're a powerful group of people when we kind of unite together and organize together and use our votes and our voices around the issues that matter the most, including starting with those kind of at the bottom of society. As a faith leader, as you said, Grove, I look at the Bible and, there's a lot of conversation in the Bible about the least of these, but the least of these are most of us in this time. And so the question is, how do we kind of build and organize from the bottom up? And what we know when we look at history and when we look at what people are doing today, it's that the problems are so vast that they need a movement. And that successful movements need to be led by those that are most impacted by the injustices that they're trying to resolve. The words of Frederick Douglass, those in pain know when their pain is relieved. Those who would be free must strike the first blow. And so, from that perspective, seeing poor and low income people, especially poor and low income women and girls and femmes, out there in the forefront of movements to both solve the immediate problems in our lives, but also to not just kind of curse the darkness, but to shine a light that says, another world is possible. And so it's why it's so great to be in the conversation here. There are people that are fighting all over this country, all over this world, who are holding out the hope that we can do better than this, and that we can achieve eco-justice, we can end poverty. We have, abundance. We just are abandoning people along the way, and it doesn't have to be. So, looking forward to more conversation about all of that.
Thank you so much. And I have to say, we can't be about cursing the darkness. We have to be able to look at a compost pile and say that putting our food scraps in there takes methane out of potentially the atmosphere, and that there's incredible regenerative powers in the darkness. So thank you so much for your thoughts for us. I wanted to just very briefly introduce one other thinker into this mix to frame the next round of thinking from you all. I've been very moved by the work on degrowth by Dr. Jason Hickel. He calls out the excess material use in the world's economy, much of which is plunder from the global south. And reducing this excess use is critical to our planetary future, along with reducing our carbon footprint and providing alternative sources of energy. And he says that even with this excess, the global north fails to meet people's basic needs because economies serve capital rather than people. And I just thought if you wouldn't mind thinking with me about the community aspect, because we can't be going into an austerity mode where people have to reduce their basic needs, or where people can't get up to a level of having what they need. But on the other hand, we do have to reduce our overall consumption. And one of the ways to do that is clearly to focus on the what's available publicly, our healthcare systems, creating peace, making it less necessary to have a job that brings you home $100,000 a year. So I just wondered if you all would be willing to share thoughts on a vision of a kind of prosperity that is possible without replicating the insanity of all of the stuff and letting us get back to a right size for the globe. Any thoughts about that from each of you within your community settings? And Liz, you're smiling at me. I'm wondering if you'd like to jump on that first.
Well, I'm happy to jump in. I definitely have lots of thoughts on this. I mean, you know, in the United States alone, we throw out more food than it takes to feed not just every person that's hungry in this country, but around the world. And in the United States alone, there are 16 abandoned houses for every unhoused person. So this notion that we just don't have enough is just a lie. And this is what's existing, you know, and so you know, and various folks that are economists and others that do work that I just look up to. It's not what I do, you know, show that indeed across the world, if we were to have a more equal society, if we actually ended poverty, it would do worlds of good for the environment. It would do worlds of good, you know, for the kind of conflict and war. I mean, just that actually inequality is at the crux of much of the harm that's happening across the world. We often will hear like, well, if everyone across the world were to be raised out of poverty, you know, it would take too much fossil fuels. It's not true. Like we just have to kind of debunk some of those myths. And yet it is very real what you're saying, that like, it's not that everyone then should have 5 cars and, you know, like this consumption, right? But you know, the biggest polluters like is the military and corporations. You know, the most powerful forces lobbying to keep things the way that they are, including how the economy is organized, including what happens to you know, our things like the fossil fuel, you know, corporations. And so so instead having like a people-centered approach and an earth-centered approach that is about you know, overcoming inequality and living sustainable lives, you know, is what actually is the only answer to the future of at least human beings being on this earth. You know, and so I think it's really important for us to both realize that it's possible, and that actually by overcoming inequality and poverty and environmental injustice and climate chaos, that this is actually the hope for everyone. I mean, it will lift from the bottom so everybody rises, right? I mean, like, but it impacts everyone in a positive way. I mean, maybe except for the bottom lines of the richest and most powerful corporations, but humanity and life and creatures would benefit greatly from turning things around. So I don't know. I know that my others here are going to have a lot more better things to say.
Riane, I wondered if you'd like to follow that with some thoughts about partnership as both a method for achieving some of that and a litmus test for when we'll have gotten there. Is that a good segue for you?
Certainly, although I would love to hear from Allison. Is she here?
She's out in the audience, and we'll have to see if she wants to come in somewhat later.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, look, as I said, I use a systems approach, and I start with what are basic human needs, and certainly food, shelter, but we also have a human yearning for caring connection. And that is very fundamental to us. And what I call domination systems, which are based on top-down rankings, starting in the family. And we've all internalized that, by the way, to some extent. So I had to make a distinction in my work between hierarchies of domination, and we are all very familiar with those, where you better obey or else there will be a lot of pain, and hierarchies of actualization, where accountability, respect, benefit don't just flow from the bottom up, but flow both ways. And there are trends in that direction, by the way, but we haven't had the vocabulary to really express that. I mean, transparency. You can't have transparency in a domination system. Accountability. You know, these are words. Empowering, right? I mean, in hierarchies of actualization, power, well, if you look at the title, The Chalice and the Blade, there are two kinds of power. The blade is the power to control, to dominate, to take life. The chalice is the power to, it's very powerful, but it's the power to give life, to nurture life, to illuminate life. And this very different definition of power informs both hierarchies of domination, you know, on the one hand, the blade or the chalice. So I have worked very much on the issue of consciousness and on a paradigm shift, because I don't think that just turning the tables and having a different group dominating is the answer to anything, okay? And we see that in so much of the developing, so-called developing world, where those on top really control most of the wealth and control most of the resources. And it isn't a question of the developed and undeveloped or so-called undeveloped nations. It's a question of everybody changing their paradigm. And again, we haven't had the language for that. So let's talk about fundamentals here. Violence has been the method of control. You know, the robber barons used that violence, you know, against strikers, against people who wanted to organize. But violence is part of our domination heritage in our families. I mean, let's really talk about fundamentals here for a moment, about cornerstones on which either partnership or domination systems are based. And it starts in our family and other intimate relations. So I would like to propose that a basic thing that we need to do to change the paradigm from domination to partnership is a campaign to stop family violence. Now, this may sound very removed, Liz, from what you're working on, but it really isn't in the least removed from it, because what a child learns in a family that is punitive, and remember I said that there's a link between that kind of family, which we've inherited, and that kind of a state or tribe. What does the child really learn? The child learns that it's okay that there are those on top and those on bottom, and that it's okay for those on top to use violence, including spanking, as a means of control. And I taught a course online at the University of Alabama, attended by graduate and undergraduate students. And some of the graduate students who were came from poor African-American backgrounds, informed me that using a switch on children was not violence, that it was a tradition in African-American families, which I doubt, but even if it were, it is violence, for goodness sakes. It is violence. So let's look at the basics here. If religious leaders were to join to stop family violence, it would make a tremendous difference, because we see shifts in parenting today towards a more caring, more, if you will, soft or feminine approach, right? I think that the idea that those on top in domination economics, for example, whether it's a Chinese emperor or an Arab sheikh or an Indian pasha or so-called, you know, I find it so hard to believe that there are people who actually believe that economics should be trickled down. I mean, it sounds obscene, doesn't it? But it's really a replay of all of these systems. Like in feudal times, those on the bottom are to content themselves with the scraps dropping from the opulent tables of those on top. So what we really need is to change the view that it is impossible to move to a more equitable, more peaceful, less violent, more fulfilling way of structuring our relations, because it's all about relations, isn't it? And so I would like to propose that the organizing is very important, but it is what are we organizing for? And my work isn't just about deconstructing and critiquing, but it's about reconstructing. It's about what do we have to build in order to have this more equitable, sustainable, and caring, yes, softer, more feminine, and we have to pay attention to this hidden system of gendered values. And once we do, we can build this. We can build this new system, but we have to understand that it cannot be done within the old paradigm where somebody has to be on top and somebody has to be on bottom. So I know I've shared a lot of information here. All I can tell you is go to our website, centerforpartnership.org, and look at some of the recent articles. I just did an article for Compass, which is the futurist publication that is very short, and it sums this up. We cannot separate our relationship to our Mother Earth from our family relations, from our economic relations. They're all of one cloth.
Thank you so much, Riane. We also put into the chat some of the links to your work, and I appreciate your systemic understanding there. Teresa, I wonder whether you might be able to weigh in for a moment, because this dominator culture that Riane is speaking to us about, and I know, I mean, I experienced that in the US. If you haven't made $1 million, you're a loser and it's your own fault. It's just insane. It infects everyone. But I wonder, Teresa, if you might think with us for a moment about from within your community structure that might be less individualistic, that might have more respect for ancestors and the next generations to come. If you'd like to speak with us about other places where a non-dominator philosophy are already in existence that would complement the analysis that Riane has just laid out for us.
Well, when we look at different First Nations people communities in Australia, you know, how they were established was either a male dominated, you know, just like Riane was speaking about coming down, or from a female perspective, you know, like, so luckily my bloodlines are all from matriarchal. So I feel very blessed with that. But, you know, like over the years, it's slightly shifted a little bit. But different communities now, it's sort of an equal balance, which is really good. Thank God for that, you know. And but at like years ago, when I was growing up in the 70s and that, even though I came from matriarchal societies and communities, and that it was still that domination, you know, of that male ego coming through, you know. And but thank God for the women of my bloodline communities, of my mother's side and my father's side, that we are very strong women and we don't tolerate that kind of behaviour. And because of that behaviour, we actually shut men down, and also the boys. So our grandchildren and the boys that are coming through now are equal, not higher than us. So we're all equal. And, you know, it's a different wave in communities this day than when I grew up in the 70s. It was quite violent. There was a lot of alcohol and stuff like that, which was really bad in communities, you know, and especially when we had what we call mission managers, you know, and with the stolen generation, children was taken away because of the alcohol and that was in Indigenous communities here. And so that went out in the early 80s. You know, it started in the early 19th century when I was establishing First Nations communities. I think it was similar, you know, with First Nations in the States, about what we call mission managers. They came from military background. So we was hoarded in like civilians of war. You know, that's how my nans used to say, when from her era growing up. She's born in 1920s. And luckily I didn't grow up in that culture, you know, and it's sort of hearing those stories from what my communities went through and how the shift has changed. You know, for example, when we look at being raised by a community, that wasn't in the past, but it is now. And what I mean, like in the past, so before colonization, yes, they were raised by a clan, you know, or community. And now we're back to that full cycle that we are being raised by a community. So when I grew up on a community, I was able to go into any house and make a sandwich, or, you know, and money wasn't really a value, you know, and who was higher or lower. So that was sort of really good to know, but I wasn't aware of it as a child. And even if we may have been living in poverty, we were rich with seafood, so we had abundant of food. We was never gone hungry, like the loaves and the fishes. That's how I say. That sort of links with my community. And over the years, we've set up a community garden where they're above ground, so it's not in the soil. That's toxic. And so we all learn, and the children in that learn to grow the garden, and so we have fresh and the different water systems and that. We have fresh vegetables and food. I mean, we still eat fish no matter what, so fish is and seafood is in our DNA. So but when we being raised by a community is absolutely amazing. We have lots of mums and we have lots of grandmothers that was disciplined by all. And not once did we was disciplined by males, because I said we're a matriarchal society, community. And it's been balanced, but even when I was growing up, I wasn't disciplined by my grandfather and uncles. It was more the grandmothers in the community. But I mean, he's like my old aunties and that, so we call them grandmothers. So it's sort of different way of looking at things in regards to hierarchy. Sort of started out like that, but it's shifted over the decades, and I think it's a better way of living. There's no hierarchy. And but when we go out of community and we go into other different institutions, I was educated by the Catholic system. I went to a Catholic boarding school, and that was the first time by the nuns that I hit, the peak of hierarchy. And I remember going up to my community, and they said, "Oh, you've changed." I said, "Because I've hit another barrier." I told them, and they said, "Oh, what is the barrier?" And I said, "It's the barrier of hierarchy. I'm not used to we used to having lots of mums and grandmothers, and being really rigid and, at a Catholic boarding school. And where all us girls were in one section and all the boys were in another section by their brothers. And but it was the nuns were very strict, I must say. But in a way, it sort of shaped me in who I am today, because by having that educational background and being at boarding school, it enabled me to see two worlds and to also walk in two worlds, from walking in a community of understanding and healing and level of that equalness, no hierarchy. But in the school system and boarding, there was a hierarchy, and in a way, at first it was very challenging for me, I must say, and really sort of like I didn't want to be there. I didn't feel wanted, but I guess religious was always very tough and very hard in those days, in the late 80s and 90s when I went to school. And but it sort of shaped me to the woman and leader I am today, and especially to walk in two worlds and help my community and the children that are coming through now, that education is the key, and it's not about hierarchy. It's about having a strong cultural background and being comfortable within your own skin, and especially with your heart. So you get to walk in two worlds, and you get to stand up for yourself, to know that you are who you are. You're not lower or higher. You're just who you are. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa. I got a lot out of what you're saying about what, in a way, is a community strengths and community prospering. to
Yes.
be able to train for the being in two worlds and navigating systems, and that it's not a vision of let's have more money, but it's of knowing who you are. So thank you for that. That's
Can I just say, Grave, it's different from my parents, my mum and nan, my dad, and especially from my grandmother, because she went through the depression, growing up in that. And it was much harder for her. And especially with racism and that, in our country. It's not as bad as the States. But when my grandmother and my mother and that were growing up, it was, and that's why our First Nations communities, when I was first established by religious orders, or the government, and they put us out as far as away from the towns because they believed that we were toxic and they didn't want to know us. They didn't even look at us as humans. And but what they didn't realise is now that they moved us right out onto near the ocean, it's $1 billion views that they're trying to buy up. So when you look at that cycle, it's actually shifted and turned back into us, and but that's how the missions and all that was set up. And we had mission managers, which was military orientated, as I said previously. So yeah, so the cycle has shifted.
And none of it's black or white. It's kind of a mess.
We have a few Irish and all that married into us. So we're multicultural here. So and it does break down racism and that. And it's absolutely amazing.
So I want to flag that we've got about half an hour left in this session. And I've got a question that's come in. I've got a question of my own to ask, and I would like to invite people who are listening to this session to think about their questions and jump in here. Next, actually, I think I'll shift to you, Liz, because I think you'll be the person who would like to address this question, which comes in from Suzanne, our webmaster, who's been serving us behind the scenes. Thank you, Suzanne. But her question is that how do we achieve a level playing field when the 1% also holds most of the power? And that's based on noticing that the discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots, the 1% and the 99%, has grown. And I wonder if you'd like to speak to that.
And it's a real reality, right? I mean, and if we look at even just the last 4 years as we come upon the 4th anniversary of the COVID shutdowns in the United States, but then also its declaration as a pandemic worldwide, that inequality and that has only deepened and intensified, right? I mean, the last 4 years created more billionaires and close to our first trillionaire, and just like at the same time as it just threw, millions more into absolute suffering. And so this question of power is a real one. And, I think, power has to be countered with power. I mean, not in the same way. And I really appreciate the conversation we're having. It's not, they say this and then we say that. Like, I'm not talking in those ways, but a transformative power, a ground up power, a decentered power. And, I again think about someone like Dr. King, who was talking about the power of poor and low income people and other folks that had been, excluded, exploited, and kind of looked over and left out. And he talks about, this kind of if we can help those who are poor and dispossessed to take action together, they will do so with a power and a freedom that will be a new and unsettling force, right? And I think that's really where I think organizing and community building comes in and movement building comes in. I mean, so, again, in the United States context, that 1/3 of the US electorate that is poor and low income, I mean, has a power with our voices and with our votes when we come together across these different lines and look at, the solutions to the problems that are plaguing society. Like we have the power, in states across the United States, if just anywhere from 1 to 20% more poor and low income people were to vote, and vote for living wages and the kind of social programs that are going to actually do something about this inequality. They exceed the margin of victory in any election, right? And so it's possible. And again, voting is not the only way. A movement takes into account all kinds of different kind of tactics and strategies. But this idea of kind of unsettling how things are and kind of transforming the kind of into a transformative power, from those who are being who are at the other end of this kind of inequality. So I think it talks about this question, or we're talking about this question of organizing, and that real solutions are coming from grassroots impacted communities.
I just wanted to add something, which is when you were talking about poverty, you mentioned in passing, Liz, that poverty affects women, and particularly women of color, the most. And I really think we need to stop talking about poverty in generalities and point to the relationship between being female and being poor. I mean, the people that you mentioned, the billionaires, they're all men. The system is not only a classist system, and it is not only a racist system. It's a domination system in which there always has to be an in-group and an out-group, starting with the in-group of mankind and the female other. And the stories about blaming Eve or Pandora for all of man's ills is brilliant to maintain domination systems. I think that much more attention needs to be paid in order to transform the system and not just change who's on top and who's on bottom, to the fact that we have a system in which so-called feminine values like caring, caregiving, and nonviolence, along with women, are systemically marginalized and devalued. I'm not saying that women have it. I mean, there are many men who are suffering as well, and many people who are transgender who are suffering, who are homosexual or gay or lesbian who are suffering. But if you look at the world, and this requires a paradigm shift, you see that women and children are the mass of the world's poor and the poorest of the poor globally. And that if we don't pay attention to that, we are really missing a transformation of the system. We're still playing within the old rules. So I want to really bring that out. And I had mentioned a campaign to stop family violence. It's not coincidental that in the United States, if it is true that African-American families, a tradition is using a switch on children, or spanking, which the majority of the world's people subscribe to, that there's so much violence in those communities, because violence is learned. And yes, it may be that men find it easier to learn. I mean, the mass of the violence in the world is performed by men, that it's easier for them to learn it, but it's these rigid gender stereotypes and the ranking of men and masculinity over women and femininity that is a huge component of the organization of the domination system. And I keep coming back to this because somehow we've all been socialized to not think of that. And so I want us to think of these four cornerstones: family and childhood, because neuroscience shows that our worldviews, our paradigms, are very much a function of the first few years of life. The good news is that we have such a strong yearning for caring connection that not everyone who grows up in these families thinks that way. But there is the gender and the system of gendered values. There's an economic system that has to be changed. Fortunately, Biden has been very much influenced through Jeffrey Hollander, his chief economic advisor, by some of the ideas in my book, The Real Wealth of Nations, of really investing in children, in care work, in paid family leave, in all of the things that are still sort of considered marginal, even by Democrats, who compromised over the bodies of women and children. Because you have to consider intra-household distribution, not just household distribution, if you're really looking at economics. And of course, story and language, those are the strategic cornerstones for transformation. And of course, we need the tactics and we need the organizing. But again, organizing for a domination system or a partnership system. And then we have to consider the whole system. And that's really my message, because I think that as part of a parallel session to the United Nations session on women, I want to again emphasize that how we organize the roles and relations of women, men, and everyone in between is a core family, social, and economic organizing principle. And that if we don't pay attention to that, well, it's just not enough to really transform the system. And the domination system at our level of technological development, population has expanded tremendously because women are not given access to family planning in some of the poorest world regions. I mean, there's tons of books of African women saying, I don't want more children. I want access to these technologies. But it's a mix of high technology and denial of family planning and other life options to women that has brought us to this critical place. So gender is really mixed up with all of this over and over and over again, isn't it?
Well, and Riane, we see coming down the pipe the care for elders and with an epidemic of dementia, and which may be well caused by the food system is implicated, and
Yes.
the care needs are going to explode out of family into whole communities with this senior care. And of course, you're right. We need to make sure that we're talking about a transformation and many at the CSW are very clear that it's the empowerment of women because the entire community benefits, and not trying to simply flip the power system as you've made clear. I've got a question coming in from the audience, and I wanted to ask you all, we're going to be not having tons of time, but I wanted to ask you all to think with me for a moment about the role of joy. Because when we look at our future, we can't just be looking at austerity, and we can't just be looking at this idea of less, less, less. And I know in your work, Riane, pleasure is a centerpiece of it. And Liz, I saw on your website, incredible 20-minute video about song, music for activism. And Teresa, right behind you, you have a beautiful piece of art. And I know you've created statues, and I know that you have the most incredible cloak that is incredible piecework. So I just wonder if we could do a round of thinking about what's the role of joy in this. Something that's not just, happiness in the sense of, oh boy, I just bought something, but something that's more generative and more related to other people, or however you might choose to think about bringing in the element of joy and claiming the future that we want now, right in this moment of saying a shared joy can be a partnership amongst people experienced right now. Who would like to speak to this?
I'll speak to this because I think that we have to make a distinction between fun and escape as joy, which is so much of what we are taught to do. And the joy that comes, well, most basically from that very feminine, quote unquote, I mean, in domination systems, emotion of not only caring and loving, and having it be, being loved, being cared for, but caring and loving another. And, you were talking, Teresa, about community, and community is really based on that, but unfortunately, in domination system is only reserved for the in-group. And empathy, which is ours by the grace of evolution, is reserved, and even scientists, quote, have said, oh, it's in our genes. You know that the Nordic nations, which have moved more to the partnership side, I mean, they're not socialist. They have a very healthy, really capitalist community of businesses, but they have less inequality, less poverty. They have more caring policies, more feminine policies, paid parental leave, universal health care. So joy comes to us not only when we are loved and cared for, but when we care and love for another. And the Nordic nations, they give more of, percentage-wise now, of their national product to people to whom they are not genetically related to, people from across the globe. We humans can extend our empathy, but only once we leave this notion that there are only two possibilities. You either dominate or you're dominated. You're either on top or you're on the bottom. Not an ideal society, because what we had for millennia wasn't ideal, although it oriented more to partnership. And gender has a huge part of that, because there are really two forms in humanity, two basic forms, aren't they? Female and male. And how we have ignored that, how these are organized and what is associated. I mean, why do you have such rigid gender stereotypes? in domination systems, whether it's the Taliban or whether it's fundamentalist Iran or whether it's the rightist fundamentalist alliance or whether it's Stalin's or Putin's Russia or Nazi Germany. It's because these are fundamental. You have to start with the in-group of mankind and the female other, and you have to have the very rigid association of, it's not that men don't get emotions, they get contempt and anger in domination systems, but the soft, more quote feminine emotions like caring, caregiving, nonviolence, no. We have to build to realize how that's interwoven, and that I think really is part of our job as women and as people who empathize with others, to show that it's a system that's the problem. It's not men. It's not even those on top, because they're frightened. You know, and so they accumulate. You know, it's talking about joy. I mean, they're joyless in so many ways and anxious. No, we have to change the paradigm. So
thank you. Thank you very much, Riane. And I also just want to call out that there are gender warriors, people who are claiming different gender identities than the ones that they were assigned at birth and taking on a fair amount of violence. And they are doing a very specific work to break down those categories along the lines that you're speaking of. So to call out.
There is this trend, but it is not connected yet to the whole systems, economic, social, and family organization.
Clearly. Now, I do just want to give Liz and Teresa a chance to talk about joy for a moment, and then I've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, and you're totally right, Riane. We need to be building from all places, weaving the truly transformative system. Absolutely, and I think we're doing some of that today. Liz or Teresa, do you want to jump in on the power of joy in sustaining what we're about, or anything along that line? Teresa, go ahead.
When I look at joy, it's about you know, what we've done for generations in my community, as I was speaking about earlier, that it's a matriarchal society, you know, and run by all the women and the grandmothers. And I think, as I also said earlier, you know, the boys are with us when we're passing on culture and knowledge and that nurturing until they're 12 years old. And I think that's the really important years of a young boy that's about to go into a young man. And to be nurtured in a way, it's sort of stopped, as I said earlier, you know, in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and just in the early 70s when I was born. And but then it changed, that old cycle and coming back. And with that, you know, there wasn't violence in my community, you know, and alcohol was to blame. That was quite brutal to the women, you know, and through alcohol, it became violence in the household, you know, and but I didn't get that to grow up in that environment. And thank God for that, because of that shift that came into the 70s. And how we were looked at as all equal, as no one higher or lower. But the women still today have the power in my community, and different communities, First Nations communities around Australia are different. They're run by male or female, and both. I think one of the a few of the communities that need a lot of work is around Uluru and that, because it's very very hard with young boys and that coming up through seeing their fathers, you know, violently abuse their mothers, you know, and then also sniffing petrol and stuff like that, which is killing their brain cells. if it's not drugs, it's petrol. And so it's in some communities, it's like, especially there's a community, Ware, up the northern part, up near Darwin, northern part of Australia, where you're not allowed to go into the community because they're at war with each other. Their houses are getting burnt down, cars are getting blown up, and that's because of the outrage of young boys and men trying to have that overall male control over the community. And so at the moment it's shut down and you can't go in there, you know, so it's different communities. And that's because certain communities that have the hierarchy of male dominance, they're the ones that are really not functioning. So, but living in a community that's, you know, managed by female energy and our grandmothers and things like that is absolutely a joy to our hearts, you know. And so it is very different, the upbringing on different communities. And, you know, I've heard about what happens in different communities over in the States and that. I have a few First Nations brothers and sisters over there who I constantly stay in touch with, and they've actually come over to my community. So we actually share cultures and stuff like that, and our stories, because stories are the power. They're a powerful story, you know, sort of emphasis in regards to passing on knowledge in that, and it changes the way that we look at things in life. And that's what brings joy to our heart. So thank you, Joy. Thank you, Grove. Wow.
Thank you, Teresa. I'm fascinated that you brought story and power and joy all in one place. Fantastic. I'm going to speak to some of the questions, and then I'm going to give Liz a closing moment. Taiwo, thank you very much for your input that being a twin may well give people the possibility of, like you've said, living in collaboration and partnering comes with you. And I hope that you are leading in that, showing your example, because you're right, none of this is dualistic thinking. There are ranges. And Robert, thank you for thinking with us about the type of spirit and the system state that we need. And yes, some of this is happening within the UN settings at the Alliance of Civilization. And yes, the power, which is not just a gun issue, but it's a different kind of transformational power towards life. And we also have had, is your name Yannick, who has talked to us very much about a powerful program. Yannick, I'm going to invite you to be in touch with me, because I'd like to send information out about your work through our e-list to people. She is working in the US Haitian diaspora, and they've got a self-paced course on economic and geopolitical drivers of war, and information on YouTube. And she's actually based in New Haven. So fantastic work. I really appreciate you beginning to share that with us, and I'd like to hear more about it. I'm afraid we've really run out of time. And Liz, I would like to give you a last moment to close us out, and then hopefully we'll all stay on after the hour just to congratulate ourselves and weave a little bit more after we've officially closed. So floor is yours, Liz.
Yeah, not to say much more, but I find the conversation about joy really important, and I think it's the right note to end on. You know, it's a joy that is in the morning. It's a hope that's in hard times. You know, it's not, you know, out of this world. It's very much in it. And when we think about a United Nations context, for all of its limitations, but also all of its strengths, you know, I think about Article 24 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that's talking about Sabbath, which is talking about rest, which is talking about joy, not as a way to, like, you know, escape, but as a way to actually live a dignified life. And so I think, you know, we have it there, and it really helps us and not to say, no, you don't deserve that, but that this is the kind of society that we all, thrive in and not just barely survive.
Thank you. What a delight to be in this session with all three of you and to see the way that your contributions overlap and weave together and highlight different pieces of this transformative movement at what is indeed a Kairos moment. And we can draw on the strength of, Riane, your work from decades. I want you to know that your partnership teaching is helping me immediately in my local community where we are trying to navigate with a huge multinational corporation. And for me to be thinking, how do we talk about partnership rather than going in feeling powerless? At least something can be transformative. We're getting thanks coming in with the into the chat, and I want to appreciate everybody who has come here today to join us and know that all of your work is so important, and we all need to be carrying on and bringing this to the ground and also up to the systems level as we move forward. Oh, goodness. So yes, thank you, thank you, thank you.